Since the announcement of One D&D and multiple Unearthed Arcanas have been released, we are starting to get a taste for what the future of Dungeons & Dragons will look like. With that in mind, I've been finding it really interesting to take a deeper dive into the older editions of the game to get an understanding for the origins of the classes in D&D and how they grew and changed over time. This will be an in-depth look at the progression of the Wizard class, or, as it was known in earlier editions, the Magic User. A quick side note, I did release a History of Wizard video about a year ago, but it had some audio issues. I've re-recorded everything and corrected some small mistakes, and thought that it would make much more sense anyway to release now alongside the ongoing changes that we are seeing. I'm also not going to be able to cover every nuance of every edition, as that would be thousands of pages of material, but I will do my best to touch on many of the main points. The Wizard is one of the most iconic depictions of not only Dungeons & Dragons, but also the fantasy genre as a whole. Something about the idea of hurling fireballs and mind-controlling foes is just so captivating, it's hard to ignore it, and it's no wonder it's been a mainstay of the game since its inception. The class that we know today as the Wizard made its debut all the way back in 1974 in the original release of Dungeons & Dragons, where the class was known as the Magic User. In a vein that might seem unorthodox today, you didn't exactly decide to be a Magic User, but rather it was almost decided for you in a sense. In original D&D, you rolled your ability scores, which were then called requisites, by rolling 3d6 in order, meaning you started with Strength, then Intelligence, Wisdom, Constitution, Dexterity, and Charisma, and your highest of Strength, Intelligence, or Wisdom would determine if you were a Fighting Man, Magic User, or Cleric respectively. Additionally, a Magic User could only be a man or elf, no other race selection was allowed. This was particularly unforgiving, as the rules didn't really leave room for rerolls, so it was entirely possible that your best requisite could still be pretty low, resulting in a less than ideal character. Much as it is today, the main ability or primary requisite as it was known for Magic Users was Intelligence. Intelligence in original D&D was arguably more valuable than it is today in 5th edition. It was used to determine both the maximum and minimum amount of spells that you could know, but also the probability of success that you would have learning a new spell. You heard that correctly. When you found a tome or wanted to learn a spell in some way, you had to roll a percentile die and compare it against a table to see if you were successful in learning that spell or not. And not having a high enough intelligence would simply lock you out of learning higher level spells entirely. Something that's probably important to note here is that early D&D was particularly deadly, as evidenced by the hit dice of the Magic User being a paltry D4 and only being able to cast one spell per day at first level. As if that wasn't dangerous enough, this is your list of available spells at first level. It's interesting to note that Charm Plants is a 7th level spell. I'm not entirely sure why, but now you know. Learning spells was a costly and time-consuming endeavor. This chart reflects the cost to learn one additional spell, noting that it also takes 1 week per level of the spell. Additionally, the gold cost only represents a 20% chance at successfully learning it. You can increase these chances by spending more gold, which scales linearly. For example, if you wanted to have a 100% chance to learn a 3rd level spell, you would need to spend 3 weeks and 40,000 gold to do so. Saving throws also work very differently in the original game, having players reference a static table for only a select few saves. As characters would level, the number that they would need to exceed to successfully save would decrease, indicating that it becomes easier. Interestingly, Magic Users consistently have the worst save against wands at every level band compared to other classes. Magic Users in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons largely function similar to their original D&D counterparts, albeit with a number of rules clarifications. Players had slightly more freedom in deciding what class they wanted to play, though the ability scores, now actually being called that, were still the primary determining factor. Intelligence Table 2 shows that, for example, a Magic User with 10 intelligence has a 45% chance to know each spell of the requisite level. Importantly, this is not that they actually know the spell, but should they come across it, this represents their chance that they can ever know the spell. Magic Users can now be elves, gnomes, half-elves, or humans, representing a significant increase in the accessibility of the class, though certain races would be limited in their ability to reach higher levels. Magic Users were still quite fragile in AD&D, still using a D4 for their hit dice, not being allowed to use any armor or shields, and being limited to only darts, staves, and daggers as combat weapons. AD&D also brought with it the inclusion of subclasses, of which the Magic User has one, the Illusionist. Though despite having some rather high ability score requirements, 15 intelligence and 16 dexterity, they aren't exactly shy about telling you that the subclass isn't very good. To quote the player's handbook, While being equal or even slightly inferior to a normal magic user in most respects, illusionists have different and highly effective spells to employ. Illusionists have more item restrictions than regular magic users, higher ability requirements, never go beyond 7th level spells, and a lower level cap. It's kind of a wonder why you might want to be one, unless you are particularly drawn to some of the select higher level spells. A quick look at the spell list and you'll also see a lot of familiar entries, from Magic Missile to Fireball to Dimension Door and all the way to Wish. You can really see that the foundation for what will become the modern wizard is clearly in motion. It wasn't until Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition that the class would finally become known as the Wizard. Along with this change, 2nd Edition brought a significant number of updates to both the game and the Wizard class. The relevance of intelligence was actually increased yet again, allowing characters with a higher score to be automatically able to detect illusions and, as such, not be affected by them. Probably the most significant inclusion in 2nd Edition for the Wizard was something that we are very familiar with these days but seems like a complete throwaway part of the game: the Schools of Magic. 2nd Edition also expanded on AD&D in the inclusion of subclasses to the game. The Wizard was provided the Mage subclass, which was essentially a generalist. While mages still retain many of the same and ability restrictions as magic users of the past, these casters were not particularly focused on anything and could simply function largely as wizards do in 5th edition. The more interesting inclusion is that of the Specialist. 2nd edition brought in the 9 schools of magic: Abjuration, Conjuration, Greater Divination, Lesser Divination, Enchantment, Illusion, Evocation, Necromancy, and Alteration, and a Specialist could choose to specialize in any of these schools, with the exception of Lesser Divination, which contained lower powered divination spells that all wizards would have access to. Specializing in a certain school of magic would have certain benefits, but also some downsides. Being a specialist would provide you with an increased 15% chance to learn spells within your designated school, but simultaneously an equivalent decreased chance to learn spells outside of your specialty. Additionally, it would not be possible to learn spells opposite of your school of magic, and even in some cases, those adjacent to your opposite. Players would need to consult this diagram to learn which schools of spells they could or could not learn. If you did opt to be a specialist, you were rewarded with an extra spell slot at each level and an increased modifier when using a spell of your given school. While the rules I'm about to discuss are for D&D 3.5, I will be saying 3rd edition throughout this section for simplicity. 3rd edition ushered in the closest version so far of the wizard that we have today and marked a clear shift in the direction of the game. Much more freedom and leniency were granted to players, and the options presented allowed you to make characters that could all feel very different. You're now more or less free to pick the race you want your wizard to be. Intelligence is still a pretty key stat, playing a large part in determining how many skill points you have. This was the predecessor to the current, much more simplified system that we have today. Additionally, the highest spell level available to you to cast was still gated by your intelligence score. Requiring at least an intelligence of 10 to be able to cast any spell, a wizard could only prepare or cast a spell if their intelligence score was greater than or equal to 10 plus the spell level. Probably the most significant thing that 3rd edition brought for the wizard was the humble but powerful cantrip. While there were some very loose descriptions of level 0 spells in earlier editions, the concept came and went over the years, but in any case, they were almost nothing like their 3rd edition counterparts. Cantrips in 3rd edition were actually good and more than just simple effects. Spells like Ray of Frost, Mage Hand, Detect Magic, and Acid Splash all made their way into the game at this point and forever changed both the power and resilience of the wizard, despite still retaining their meager D4 hit dice. 3rd edition maintained the ability to specialize in a particular school of magic, similar to the system that existed in 2nd edition, but did away with the idea of opposing schools. Instead, if you chose to specialize in a school of magic, you had to choose any 2 other schools that you could not gain any spells from. It might be hard to believe, but it also wasn't until 3rd edition that feats were introduced into the game. Players could select a feat starting at 1st level and again at 3rd, and then every 3 levels after that. This really allowed for more interesting and diverse characters that had a wide range of powers. Wizards had a plethora of choices to improve their characters, from craft wondrous item, spell focus, and spell penetration. Ultimately, 3rd edition completely reshaped the identity of the wizard class and made it significantly more forgiving to play. And 4th edition. I'm not really sure what to say other than Wizards of the Coast seem to love wizards so much that they decided to turn every class into a wizard. This edition is so dramatically different from everything before and after it that honestly it's very difficult to even compare and probably deserves a video of its own. I'll break it down as follows. Rituals were introduced, but not in the same way that we know them now. Spellbooks have a defined page limit. Spells were actually powers, and every class kind of has them, but actually they are still also spells. Spell levels also don't exist, they just correspond to character level now. Thunderclap is a level 23 spell. Man, that got a demotion. And oh yeah, a wizard could also basically be a god. All of this brings us to the wizard that we know and love today. Intelligence is no longer a particularly important ability. The spells that you learn are no longer gated by it either. You simply gain access to more and higher level spells as you take more levels in the wizard class. The concept of specializing doesn't really exist anymore, and the schools of magic feel much more like a relic of the past than anything else. Yes, the school selected by a wizard at 2nd level will grant certain bonuses, but it hardly seems as meaningful as it once did. Ritual casting, a concept originating in 4th edition, received a bit of an overhaul and was brought forward into 5th edition. This allows certain spells with the ritual tag to be cast without consuming the normal spell slot it would otherwise. 5th edition also brought a number of quality of life improvements to the wizard, doubling down on the cantrips introduced in 3rd edition, including having the ability to swap them out at regular intervals since the publication of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Streamlining spellcasting and ability checks, 5e really made the wizard substantially easier and more forgiving to play, and it finally got a d6 hit dice. While the modern wizard certainly lacks the complexity and discipline required in earlier editions, the current iteration is inarguably more approachable and probably more fun. I can certainly see the appeal of playing a wizard from earlier editions, but I don't think that future editions will really be taking much of a step back. I hope you enjoyed this look at the wizard of the past. If you did, consider leaving a like and subscribing to my channel. Also, feel free to take a look at some of my other content, it's all linked on screen now. But otherwise, take care.